much for the response. I appreciate your research on subjects, and I most certainly appreciate your kindness with the way you respond to my videos. I will state I would have loved to have an elder like yourself in my own congregation. Now, on to your response. I feel compelled to point out that you really didn't answer the question. Your answer essentially was to let Jehovah decide. However, that's not really the case. Let's see if I can explain that. Since putting up that video, I have had to do enormous amounts of research in order to keep up with the comments on that video to see if any answers I was getting made any sense at all. This is essentially what it boils down to, at least from what I've researched. Real quick, I gotta give you a correction. Now, this is kind of my fault as it's written out on my video, even though I allude to something else. Blood transfusions are rarely ever whole blood transfusions. In fact, they are so rare that I could say never, and I doubt many could find a case to prove me wrong. Currently, of course. So, when a Jehovah's Witness say abstain from blood in any blood transfusions, they're banning portions of blood being transfused. So, let's run through those available transfusions real quick to get an idea of what blood actually is. White blood cells. Now, there are white blood cell transfusions. They're occasionally done, but really what's more than likely done is something called a bone marrow transplant. White blood cells are created in the bone marrow. Bone marrow transplants are accepted by Jehovah's Witnesses. So in turn, since that's where white blood cells are created, and they are transfused along with bone marrow, Jehovah's Witnesses can receive a white blood cell transplant. Platelets. Funny thing about platelets is that they're never really referred to as platelets. In the ER, they're referred to as clotting factors. This is another portion of blood that's accepted to be transfused by Jehovah's Witnesses. Red blood cells. This is by far the most common of all transplants. Can Jehovah's Witness accept this without repercussion? No. If a Jehovah's Witness accepts a transfusion of red blood cells, they will be disfellowshipped. Now, wait a minute. Didn't we establish in your response that when blood is broken up into parts, the definition of blood becomes murkier, and it should be a conscience matter? So when Jehovah's Witnesses say that they accept parts of blood, but not whole blood, because once blood is separated, it's no longer blood, well, they must be lying. Red blood cells do not make up whole blood. That's really a strange caveat, wouldn't you say? I think it's strange. White blood cells are accepted, platelets are accepted, but red blood cells aren't? So what is the explanation for why red blood cells aren't accepted if it's only a portion of blood? If you're looking for an answer from the Watchtower, you won't find one. It's just a mandate. However, the general answer is that a red blood cell is too large of a portion of blood and therefore is unacceptable. Now here's where things get really weird. If you do research on what a red blood cell is, which I feel is the real problem with the blood doctrine, is that Jehovah's Witnesses are not researching what blood is and simply accepting any directive in the medical field from the Watchtower, who doesn't seem to do the research themselves. But if you do the research on what a red blood cell is, you'll find what makes up a red blood cell is hemoglobin. In fact, in a mature red blood cell, the only component is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin wrapped in a cell membrane. You might be asking, how important is a cell membrane to the red blood cell? Let's put it this way. The job of a red blood cell is to aerate the bloodstream from the lungs. Without the cell membrane, hemoglobin still stays active and still does its job, sometimes even more efficiently, without the membrane. Even the enzymes that are attached to your red blood cell to determine your blood type are actually anchored in hemoglobin. Without the cell membrane, hemoglobin simply holds on to them. Hemoglobin can exist without being a red blood cell, but a red blood cell is not a red blood cell without hemoglobin. So the idea that something can be too big of a portion of blood to be accepted mustn't be right if hemoglobin is accepted to be transfused. So what is the reason? Why is it red blood cells cannot be transfused? If you're asking yourself, what exactly is the line where blood is no longer considered blood, the only answer you're left with, if you're going by accepted and unaccepted portions from the Watchtower of blood, is a cell membrane. Even that's a little strange to say since white blood cells can be transfused, but I digress. The whole thing boils down to a cell membrane. So, going back to your answer, you said when blood is broken up, it's a good idea to have it be a conscience matter and let Jehovah decide. That's not what Jehovah's Witnesses have done, though, have they? They've taken the decision out of Jehovah's hands. Think about the parts of blood. You can be disfellowshipped for receiving a red blood cell transplant, but you will not be disfellowshipped for receiving hemoglobin. How exactly is that leaving things in Jehovah's hands? And how exactly is that leaving up to Jehovah to decide? I want to say it's ironic here that you mentioned the Pharisees in response, because what was the thing that Jesus most criticized them for? Wasn't it that they took the law and compounded it with minute details about everything? There were a list of acceptable and unacceptable things to do on the Sabbath. When the law required the Israelites to wash their hands thoroughly, the Pharisees added the provision that they had to wash all the way up to their elbows, right? If the Pharisees were around today, how do you think they would handle the law to abstain from blood? Would they take the nature of the law to not eat blood and allow medical procedures that transplant it? Something like obeying the law about not cannibalizing your fellow humans' organs, but allowing them to be transplanted because it's not the same as eating them? Do you think they'd do that? Or would you think the Pharisees would have a list of all the components of blood and arbitrarily choose which ones could and couldn't be accepted? Arbitrarily deciding what is too big to be accepted, what is small enough to be accepted? Do you think that the rules they made up regarding the law would boil down to something as small as, say, a cell membrane? You've heard of the phrase paper thin, right? Like, this case is paper thin. Do you know how thin a cell membrane is? This rule is not just paper thin, it's cell membrane thin. And if you look for a reason for the rule, it's even thinner than that. It's non-existent.